Racist cop slaps black judge in court, then instantly regrets it in front of everyone. Just one look, and a black child gets pulled into the machinery of a system that was supposed to protect him. Before we dive into this story, let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Monday morning, and the air in Nashville still held a chill after the night's rain. In the Tennessee State Courthouse, courtroom number 4 opened its first session of the week with a case so minor that many clerks didn't even glance at the file title: Obstruction of Justice. Wolfgang Ford, male, 16 years old. But right inside that small room, a silent crack was forming in the wall of justice. Wolfgang Ford, the black boy who had just turned 16, sat quietly at the far end of the defendant's table. His curly hair was untrimmed, and his small shoulders slumped beneath a faded white shirt that hung too loosely on his frame. His youthful face was speckled with acne, his eyes lowered, as if his very presence was a crime. Next to him sat the court-appointed attorney, who had only met Wolfgang 15 minutes earlier. On the other side stood the accuser, Officer Jacob Brantley, 42 years old, with over 15 years in the state police force. He had received the title Model Officer of Residential District 8 3 times, each for quickly handling disturbances caused by youth of color. His personnel file was thick with commendations, though scattered among them were citizen complaints, all closed with the same conclusion: insufficient evidence for internal action. Judge Silas Davies presided in silence. The only black judge in the federal circuit of the region, he was no stranger to cases like this. He once said, "Justice doesn't need to shout to be heard, but sometimes it needs to stay silent at the right moment." And today, he was silent. To listen. Jacob began his statement in a monotone voice, like reading a weekly report. "I was patrolling District 8 at 8:12 p.m. Friday. A group of teens were gathered on the sidewalk, causing a disturbance. I ordered them to disperse. The subject, Ford, looked directly at me and refused to comply. The look in his eyes was defiant. That was the first sign of confrontational behavior, typically seen in individuals with violent potential." The courtroom stenographer's keyboard clicked softly, but in that space, every word Jacob spoke seemed to leave a mark. Judge Silas Davies raised his head. "How tall is the boy?" he asked. Jacob answered immediately. "Approximately 5'3". "And you?" "6'3". Silas set his pen down. He didn't follow up right away. Instead, he stared directly at Jacob, his eyes carrying a very different kind of silence. Not anger, not suspicion. Just a quiet refusal rising slowly to the surface. "And based on a look alone, you assessed that he posed a threat requiring control by force?" he asked, his tone as even as a simple equation. Jacob raised an eyebrow, unfazed. "I've worked that neighborhood nearly 9 years. I know that look. It's the first sign of provocation." A few people in the courtroom shifted slightly. No one spoke, but the mood had changed. From initial indifference, something now made people sit a little straighter. Wolfgang remained still, hands resting on his knees, saying nothing. But in his eyes, something was quietly boiling, not anger. A question: can just one look really be seen as a weapon? Silas leaned back, fingers interlaced on the bench. In his mind, old voices echoed, the voices of dozens of teens he'd seen in similar trials. And this time, he knew. That look didn't belong to just Wolfgang Ford. It belonged to millions of other children who had once bowed their heads, once been judged, once been accused, simply because they dared to look back. And this would be the first time the system was forced to look at itself. If justice is the place where a person must strip away everything to be seen for who they truly are, then Jacob Brantley entered the courtroom that day, wearing armor made of authority and rhetoric. He didn't simply show up as a witness. He arrived like someone accustomed to standing above all else, even above the law. Polished black shoes, a beige stout police uniform so stiffly pressed it could slice through air, a silver badge gleaming under the overhead lights. Jacob's stride was slow, assertive, as if each step was custom measuring the entire room. His broad shoulders and thick arms swelled beneath the heavy fabric as he walked in like he owned the place. And this hearing was nothing more than routine inspection. When asked to take the witness stand, Jacob didn't look around, didn't bow his head, but sat down as if he had just completed a noble mission. One leg casually crossed, arm draped over the chair's edge, he tilted his chin upward, eyes sweeping the room as if sizing up an invisible audience in a stage performance. Judge Silas Davies remained motionless on the high bench. No reaction, no expression. But those who had worked under him knew, when Silas stayed silent for this long, it meant he was preparing to dismantle a structure that had stood for far too long. Have you ever used force against a white suspect in a similar situation? Silas asked, his voice level, like a barometric reading. Jacob didn't need time to think. He shrugged, let out a faint chuckle. Different. That girl didn't look at me like I was the enemy. She knew how to listen. A few glances from the courtroom turned upward. Silas took notes but gave no reply. Not because he had nothing to say, but because he was giving Jacob more rope to hang himself. Jacob continued explaining, though no one had prompted him. I've worked in District 8 for over 9 years. Every day I face those defiant stares. If I don't act first, someone dies, and it won't be me. Each word from his mouth landed like sugar-coated bullets, smooth, forceful, familiar, and dangerously routine. Silas still didn't respond, but by now, the whole room could feel something shifting beneath the wooden floorboards. Kids like him, I see them every day, Jacob added, pointing subtly toward Wolfgang. If you don't get control from the start, anything can happen. Kids like him, Silas repeated, not with a smirk, not with emphasis, not with sarcasm. Just a quiet echo, like a mirror reflecting the speaker's words right back at him. Jacob blinked. For the first time, the confident haze in his eyes seemed to falter for half a second, but he quickly masked it with a firm furrow of the brow. In the back row, a middle-aged woman in a blue suit pulled out her phone. She didn't raise it high, didn't point it deliberately, just quietly pressed record. Every word Jacob spoke now, no matter how cloaked in experience, training, or habit, was being captured like slivers of audacity he didn't even realize he was revealing. Silas tilted his head, not toward the camera, but straight at Jacob. So, in your eyes, the gaze of a black teenager is threat enough to warrant suppression? Jacob answered without hesitation. That wasn't an ordinary look. It was the kind I've seen in someone just before they strike. Silence fell across the courtroom. But it was no longer the silence of a formal proceeding. It was the silence of people realizing they had just heard a confession from someone who didn't know he had confessed. Judge Davies leaned back. Good, he said quietly. Everything is being recorded. At that moment, Wolfgang, whom everyone had nearly forgotten was sitting at the defendant's table, lifted his gaze. He didn't speak, but something in his face had changed. No longer fear. It was the look of someone who now understood. That towering figure over there, no matter how large, no matter how gleaming the armor, was starting to crack. Justice doesn't always begin with the law. Sometimes it begins with a 15-second clip. That day, at 2:08 p.m., on the platform X, formerly Twitter, a short video began to spread at lightning speed. The interface was shaky, the image blurry, The audio tangled with footsteps. But the content, it was enough to choke America in its throat. Jacob Brantley, hand gripping the collar of Wolfgang Ford, a boy just 16, dragging him down the courthouse hallway like an unclaimed object. No explanation, no lawyer, no ruling. Just the silence of violence dressed in authority. The person who filmed it was a janitor on the afternoon shift, standing beside a fire extinguisher on the third-floor hallway. He didn't speak, didn't zoom in, didn't add music. Just an instinctive press of the record button. And a simple caption. Is this what justice looks like? Within 6 hours, the clip had been shared over 52,000 times. On Reddit, it topped the justice served category. On TikTok, activists began overlaying it with a heartbeat soundtrack. On Facebook, the hashtag #sign Wolfgang was dragged was trending. 4 hours after the clip went viral, the door of courtroom number 4 swung open again, this time off schedule. A black woman entered, slender build, curly hair tied back, shoes marked with hallway dust. She didn't need an introduction. Her name was O'Reilly Ford, Wolfgang's mother. She had no lawyer with her, didn't wait for a summons, didn't need security to guide her. She walked straight in, her gaze like a spear honed by pain and fury. I didn't come here for explanations, she said, voice steady. I came to see the video with my own eyes. I want to witness my son being dragged like an animal, and I want to know why no one stopped it. Jacob Brantley, with his usual demeanor, leaned back and smiled, as if reciting lines from a script he knew by heart. They're used to being forgiven, he said, so they always think they're the victim. The words fell into the room like a dull blade. Some took deep breaths, some looked down. But Orley didn't blink, and Silas Davies didn't strike his gavel. Instead, he raised his head and looked at the guard approaching the woman. "Stop," he ordered, voice soft as wind. Then he turned to the court clerk, slow and clear. "Request the full footage from the west hallway." Unedited. No cuts. No blur. No one moved for 5 seconds after that. Not because of the order, but because no one had ever heard a state judge issue a command like it was a matter of life and death. Orley stood still. No shouting, no tears. But her eyes, those eyes, made the entire courtroom look down at the wooden floor beneath them. A mother didn't need to say much, because everyone understood. Her presence alone had said enough. In the public gallery, a young woman quietly turned on her phone. That same 15-second clip was still playing. But this time, Wolfgang's labored breathing could be heard more clearly. Silas didn't look at the screen. He looked at Jacob, not with anger, but with an icy resolve. "From this point forward," he said softly, "all evidence will be seen." And from that moment on, the investigation was no longer about a look. It was about a system, and about the hands that dared to drag a child through the hallway of justice, as if no one was watching. But now, the whole world had seen it, and a mother had lit the fire, not with blood, but with evidence, and with truth. No one expected that the request to review a string of old case files, something that seemed like bureaucratic procedure, would end up unlocking the door to a room that had been sealed shut for years. But Silas Davies was not the kind of man to make meaningless requests. When he ordered a full audit of every case Officer Jacob Brantley had been involved in over the past 10 years, he was testing the bloodstream of a system, and it began to bleed out stains too dark to deny. The first person to sense that flow was Roddy Marshall, an investigative journalist who had once been pulled over by Jacob on the highway for unfocused driving, exactly 7 years earlier, when she was still a trainee reporter for the local news station. Back then, she chose silence, closed her notebook, and moved on, But this time, with the video of Wolfgang spreading across social media and Judge Davies's investigation made public, Rati decided to return to the very place she had once turned away from. Without waiting for a press conference or police department statement, Rati began tracking the names scattered throughout those complaints marked insufficient grounds for internal action. Within 10 days, she made over 30 phone calls, sent 47 emails, knocked on 11 doors, and from behind those old walls, ghosts began to emerge, carrying memories that had never been named. Ark Ellis was the first to dare speak into her recorder. A 43-year-old truck driver once pulled from his cab in the middle of a video call with his daughter just because of a broken taillight. I didn't resist, but he shouted, swung his arms, and dragged me like I was a threat to all of America. The last thing I heard from my daughter was her scream through the phone, "Daddy!" Then the screen went black. Kara Johnson, a senior medical student, recounted through tears. I was talking to my mom on the phone when he told me to hang up. No reason. When I asked why, he said I was showing signs of tension. I was detained for 4 hours. No notification. No lawyer. At that point, I thought I'd never get out. And then there was Yuri Green, a 22-year-old young man once arrested simply for not carrying ID while walking home after a night class, who quietly recalled, "I just asked for the time." Really? I asked what time it was. He said I was challenging his authority. Rati listened to each of them, each word. None of them knew one another. They came from different counties, different professions, different age groups. But 3 chillingly clear similarities emerged. They were young, they had dark skin, and they had all been targeted by Jacob Brantley, without evidence, without reason, without explanation. She named her investigative series Brantley's Shadow Files. When the first article of the series went live on the regional paper's homepage, it drew over 280,000 reads in just 2 days. But the significance wasn't in the view count. It was in the hundreds of messages that poured into Rati's inbox, from people who had once believed they were the only ones ever crushed beneath someone's boot. I was also pulled out of my car by him for driving too slow, one wrote. I didn't have a camera, no witnesses, just fear, another confided. But this time they were no longer afraid, not because they had been vindicated, but because, for the first time, someone had turned on the light so the ghosts could step into it and be called by name. In her makeshift workspace, Rati pinned each note, each name, each case to the board. And as the afternoon sun lit up that patch of wall, she smiled faintly. At last, the picture has taken shape. Because darkness cannot silence the truth forever. Not when someone begins to listen. Among the hundreds who stepped into the light, there was one who remained in the shadows, not out of fear, but because he was doing what few dared to do, going deep into the heart of the system. His name was Isaac Gray, 26 years old, a Level 2 legal clerk in the records archive of the Tennessee State Court. A quiet young man, introspective, often arriving before work hours and leaving last. To most, his job was simply to keep company with dusty file cabinets, PDF folders, and yellowed printouts. But Isaac believed that every preserved word was a witness who could no longer scream. When Rati Marshall submitted a request to retrieve all documents linked to Officer Jacob Brantley, Isaac was assigned to the review. Audit reports, recorded statements, witness testimonies. Hundreds of documents were opened, rearranged, categorized by year, location, and level of complaint. And then he started noticing something wrong. 3 case files, one from 2018, another from 2020, and the most recent from late 2022, all shared the same odd detail. The witness statement sections were typed in bold italic Times New Roman, while the rest of the document used the default aerial light. This was nearly impossible in a system that had been standardized for over a decade. Isaac checked the metadata on the server. All 3 files had been modified after 11 p.m., a time when the archive office was locked. The users? One was Jacob Brantley, and the other, Paul Renner, a former deposition typist who had retired in early 2023. He chose not to send an email. Instead, he descended into the basement, the storage floor for physical files prior to 2021. And there, he found the unedited original of a case labeled as closed by internal procedure. The case involved Guy Madden, a 16-year-old black teenager stopped by Jacob Brantley at 11:42 p.m. near the Park Zone by Oak Ridge gas station. The reason for the arrest? Suspicious behavior indicating possible evidence disposal. But the note in the original file clearly stated, "No signs of resistance. Recommend warning and release on site." In the newer version, that line was deleted. In its place, a far more chilling sentence. "Defiant behavior, non-compliant. Use of restraint recommended." Guy Madden died less than an hour later at Maplewood Medical Center. In the file, the listed cause of death was stark and cold. Respiratory failure, cause unknown. No cameras, no witnesses, just a deadly timeline and a stack of falsified pages. Isaac's hands trembled as he reached the final line. That boy was dead. And for the past 3 years, his death had lived on only as a footnote in a resolved internal matter. Isaac printed the entire original file, pressed it into a red folder, and climbed the stairs to Judge Silas Davies's office. No clerk, no appointment. Just a knock on the door, and a pair of eyes that didn't look away. "Sir," Isaac said, voice not loud, but each word rang like a bronze bell. "Statistics are just ink stains, but this is a human life." Silas Davies froze as he flipped through the pages. He had seen many victims in his career, but this was the first time a low-ranking employee from within the system had pointed a finger straight into the gut of the very institution he worked for. For a moment, no one said anything. But that silence was a promise, that from this day on, no case file would be edited at midnight without being exposed. And from that day forward, the name Isaac Gray was no longer that of an ordinary records clerk. He became the keeper of the memories of those who never got the chance to tell their stories. There are moments that can't be rewound, and there are sounds, like a slap, that don't echo over radio waves, don't need amplification through a mic, but still have the power to awaken an entire system long deadened by the habit of acceptance. It was a Tuesday afternoon, 2:16 p.m., and courtroom number 4 was nearly full. Nearly 50 people were present. Lawyers, journalists, intern law students, and curious citizens who had followed the case through the news. The atmosphere was thick, like someone had lit gunpowder, but no one dared strike a flame. Jacob Brantley, once hailed as a symbol of order in the northern suburbs, could no longer maintain his usual composure. Documents from Isaac Gray had been submitted, and Roddy Marshall's investigative series had begun to be publicly quoted. All eyes turned to him, not with reverence, but with suspicion, disappointment, and anger. And when Silas Davies, the man who had presided over the courtroom with unwavering calm, sternly declared, "The court has sufficient grounds to recommend a criminal investigation into Officer Brantley's falsified reporting," that was the very moment something no one expected occurred. Jacob stepped straight up to the bench, his voice grinding through clenched teeth. "Who do you think you are? You put on that robe and think you can order me around? You've never stood on the street, never faced people like them." Silas didn't have time to reply before Jacob's right hand, large, veined, wrapped in the familiar half-glove of a patrol officer, suddenly swung upward and slapped him across the face. The slap cracked against Silas's left cheek like a gunshot in a silent cathedral. A woman in the third row covered her mouth. A student intern dropped his pen to the floor. No one had time to intervene. No one believed it was real. Silas didn't fall. He didn't flinch. He simply turned his head back, a red mark blooming on his cheek, but his eyes still held the same unwavering light, integrity. He spoke slowly, each word slicing into the wooden ceiling above. Record this as an assault on a judge during proceedings. I will recommend prosecution under Section 115 of the Federal Code. Maximum sentence, 8 years. A female court clerk, no one knew since when, had pulled out her phone and was recording everything. No one stopped her, because by now everyone understood. There was nothing left to hide. Not 2 minutes later, the door at the back of the courtroom opened. A tall man in plain clothes, with a gleaming silver badge pinned to his collar, stepped inside. He wasn't harsh, didn't deliver a speech. Just one firm sentence. "Officer Brantley, you'll be coming with us." Now. For the first time in his life, Jacob couldn't find the words. His eyes darted around, searching for a comrade, a superior, a lawyer, anyone who once stood by him. But that courtroom was no longer a bunker of privilege. It was a stage for truth, and the audience was awake. 2 supervising officers approached. Jacob didn't move. No one reached for the weapon at their side. They simply flanked him, a final ritual for a man long shielded. And then, without glory, without sirens, he was led away under the gaze of those he had once shoved to the margins. And the most chilling part, no one screamed, no one cheered, because everyone knew today's slap wasn't just a personal outburst. It was the final blow against a system that once cradled evil in the phrase, "just procedure." But this time, that very procedure was used to expose what had long hidden beneath the name of justice. And the one who took the slap wasn't just Silas Davies. It was an entire culture that believed it would never be forced to face the light. No one expected that a case so seemingly small, sparked by nothing more than a boy's glance, would open the door for an entire society to speak. But Silas Davies had seen it coming early on. After Jacob Brantley was arrested for assaulting a judge in open court, Silas chose not to quietly manage things behind closed doors. Instead, he made a bold decision. He moved the entire trial to the State Hall of Justice, a venue that could seat over 200 people, and, most notably, he allowed public video coverage. For the first time in nearly a decade, justice no longer hid behind closed curtains. On the day of the hearing, sunlight filtered through the dusty, frosted windows of the hall. People had been lining up since 6:45 a.m. Some wore formal suits, others plain t-shirts, elderly with canes, young children waiting on their mother's lap on the courthouse steps. They weren't there out of curiosity. They were there because they needed to witness, with their own eyes, that this time, someone had dared to let the light shine on what had long been buried. The first person to enter the chamber was Rati Marshall, carrying a stack of documents, the reflection of the ceiling lights glinting off her black-rimmed glasses. She was followed by Ark Ellis, dressed in a clean driver's uniform. Then came Kara Johnson, her hair tied neatly, eyes no longer wet like they were when she spoke to the press. And Uri Green, the young man who was once arrested for not wearing a watch. None of them had subpoenas, yet they walked in as survivors. For the first time, they knew they were no longer alone. Judge Silas began the hearing with a low, clear voice, each word echoing through the chamber. Today is not about punishing an individual. It is about asking whether an entire system has learned to respond, or whether it's still lulling itself to sleep with silence. No one clapped. No one fidgeted. Only the soft click of camera keys could be heard. The first to be called to testify was Yuri Green. He stood tall, wearing a plain white shirt, his curly hair combed neatly. It was 10:14 p.m. I had just left the campus library and stood under a street lamp calling my mom, about to ask what time it was, when he approached. I asked first, "Excuse me, do you know what time it is?" Then I was told to hang up, handcuffed and detained until the next afternoon. Jacob cut in from the defendant's table. He had an attitude when he spoke. The chamber stirred, but Silas didn't furrow his brow. He flipped open the file on the desk. According to the report you submitted, he was wearing a white shirt, carried no suspicious items, showed no threatening behavior, didn't run, and was standing under public lighting. A completely unremarkable location. Jacob scowled but tried to keep his voice steady. There could still be a risk. We have to respond to ensure safety. Silas didn't raise his voice. No weapons, no assaultive behavior, no verbal threats. And he was held for 12 hours, without a warrant, without legal counsel. That was your response to a question about the time. 1 second of silence, then 2, then 10. The entire hall was frozen in stillness. Even the camera crew stopped their hands. Jacob's eyes began to roam, searching for someone who might have once stood with him. A fellow officer, a familiar attorney, even a nodding acquaintance. But no one remained. Everyone sat upright. They were no longer those who could understand your actions. They had become witnesses. At that moment, the live viewership of the trial had surpassed 650,000, according to local NBC data. From Milwaukee to New Orleans, from quiet neighborhoods to major universities, people were sharing a single hashtag. Number. Ask the time not for your life. A question that once seemed harmless, "Do you know what time it is?" had now become a symbol. Because when even a simple question can get you detained, the problem is not the question. It's the people who believe they have the right not only to ignore it, but to punish you for asking. That was the morning a society began to speak, and the most memorable part was not the tears. It was the final silence of the man who once believed he'd never have to listen. When the wave of public outcry reached its peak, when videos and testimonies flooded primetime broadcasts, a closed-door meeting was quietly held at the headquarters of the Federal Judicial Council in Nashville. No press, no cameras, no recording devices. Only the people who held the scales of justice, and within them, scars that had never truly healed. It was a small oak-paneled room, barely 50 square meters in size, but inside it was a world where even justice itself had once needed to knock before entering. The first to speak was Judge Chloe Hendress, 52 years old, one of the first black women to hold a senior position on the Southeastern Court of Appeals. Her voice was low but steady. On my first day at work, the security guard stopped me at the entrance, asked me to queue up for a metal check with the people filing paperwork. I told him I was a judge. He looked me up and down and said, "Sorry, ma'am, you'll need an employee badge or an official letter of confirmation." No one laughed, because no one was surprised. Next was Judge Kevin Zuo, of Chinese descent, 45 years old, originally from Boston, appointed at just 38, one of the youngest in state judicial history. He spoke slowly. I wore a black robe, my name badge clearly visible, entered through the designated entrance. The escort staff walked with me. Yet security asked me to stop and present ID. I asked why. They said, "We're just following protocol for those who look like it's their first time here." From the far end of the room, a silver-haired man with deep bronze skin took a deep breath. "I'm a retired federal judge. In 29 years of service, I was mistaken at least 17 times for defense counsel, just because I'm black. Not once. 17 times. There were no sniffles, no self-pity, only silent nods. Nods that quietly said, "I've been there too." Finally, Silas Davies spoke. He didn't need to raise his voice. His words weren't meant to argue. They were meant to settle what had never been written in any official record. If even those who hold the scales of justice, wear robes, bear nameplates, possess the authority to decide life and death, must still beg to be seen as human, then this system is broken at its core. Silence enveloped the room, but this time, it wasn't the silence of fear or helplessness. It was the silence of truth. An elderly woman with brown skin and neatly braided hair, seated in the far left corner, was the recorder. She wasn't part of the legal field. She represented the Committee on Sensitive Testimonial Archives, which stores unofficial accounts from high-ranking members of the judiciary. After the meeting, she added one handwritten note at the bottom of her record. For the first time, the meeting room was no longer a place to hide, but the beginning of a new chapter. The meeting's transcript, coded internally as 7-1B/F-2025, was later proposed as required reading in the Judicial Training Program for new judges under the course Ethical Conduct and Systemic Awareness. It marked the first time that personal recollections were not filed under incidental, but treated as collective evidence for a system in need of dissection. That day, there was no verdict, no ruling. But something became clearer than any official decree. Those who had once been silent had begun to speak. And this time, they weren't speaking to be comforted. They were speaking to make the system listen. No one noticed when Isaac Gray left the formal trial early that day. In a light gray suit, he looked like an ordinary judicial clerk, until he appeared before the podium of the Tennessee State Judicial Oversight Committee at 10:15 a.m., holding a thick file folder, its corners curled from being flipped through too many times. Isaac did not raise his voice. He had no experience with public speaking or media presentations, but he carried something no one in that room dared to dismiss: truth exposed through data. In the span of 6 years, Isaac said, I found 18 files that were altered outside of protocol. All of them involved youth or adults of color. Among them, 14 were black, 3 were Latino, and 1 was of Arab descent. He didn't stop at the numbers. He projected onto the screen the original line from the deposition in the case of Guy Madun, the 16-year-old boy who died after being held in a chokehold. No resistance. Recommend warning. Explain wrongful behavior. But in the version submitted to court, displayed dismissive attitude, potential resistance, restraint recommended. Each page of the file was a punch to the gut for anyone who had ever believed justice was a neutral stream, because now it could be darkened with just a few keystrokes, and by someone who believed they had the power to rewrite reality itself. Judge Silas Davies sat at the front table, not taking notes. But when Isaac finished his presentation, he asked just one question. Does anyone here believe this was a clerical error? Silence. Complete. Not a single hand was raised. At that very moment, outside the state courthouse, a quiet crowd had gathered since early morning. They carried no banners, no chants. They brought sheets of white paper, each one bearing the name of a victim of violence, misconduct, or racialized criminalization. An elderly man, over 70, wearing a worn suit with frayed shoulders, bowed his head and read, James Lil J. Moore, 14 years old, detained on suspicion of carrying a lighter in the park. A girl no older than 10 whispered through trembling lips, "My dad, Rafael Duran." His ribs were broken because he ran too fast near a gas station. After reading each name, they dropped the sheet into a wooden box placed at the courthouse entrance. No one made demands. No one shouted for justice. That box was called the memory chest, carved from an oak tree struck by lightning 20 years earlier, built by the local community. On the lid, a line was engraved: "If justice forgets, memory will remind." By the end of that day, more than 430 sheets had been placed inside. On social media, the hashtag number "No More Corrections" trended worldwide, surpassing 3.1 million mentions in just 24 hours. The evening news no longer spoke of just one police officer. They spoke of a system that once assumed numbers could stay silent. But when wounded, even data knows how to scream. That day, Isaac Gray did not go straight home. He passed by the wooden box, stood silently, and looked at the nameless papers, bearing only the names of those long forgotten. And in a strange, quiet moment, he understood that he was no longer an administrative clerk. He, and all those silent people outside, had become the record keepers of what history once tried to erase. Because no one has the right to edit someone else's pain. Not one more time. No more arguments. No more rebuttals. That morning's trial began with nothing more than the press of a button. The main screen in the special courtroom played a video just 12 seconds long, but it seemed to stretch the entire history of America across those frames. No voiceover, no narration, no effects. Just slow motion. The right hand of Jacob Brantley, a seasoned police officer once praised for maintaining order, rising and striking the cheek of Judge Silas Davies. Silas's face turned, and then, like a statue forged from unshakable belief, he turned back, his gaze unchanged. No anger, no fear. Only one thing: resolve. When the screen went black, the room fell utterly silent. Silas stood up. No need for a gavel. He simply said, "Justice does not need revenge. It only needs to be protected, even when no one applauds." It was not just a statement. It was a truth. 2 days later, the federal office announced it would reopen the case of Guy Madden, the black teenager who died under suspicion of unlawful behavior and unexplained respiratory failure. This time, there was no press release, no polished phrasing. They sent a handwritten note to the Madden family, signed by 3 levels of leadership. "We are sorry. The system failed to protect your son, and now it must make amends." At the same time, the State Police Oversight Committee suspended 12 officers linked to files showing signs of unauthorized edits. Among them were 2 district captains and 1 deputy chief investigator. Outside the Tennessee State Courthouse, the digital sign at the front gate, once displaying the slogan, "One slap, one wake," as a symbol of reckoning, was changed. Not by a technician's hand, but by public consensus through an online vote. The new message read, "Justice must outlive power." In one of the courthouse hallways, amid streams of passers-by, a high school student named Myra Leon, 16 years old, a classmate of Wolfgang Ford, wrote in black marker on the public bulletin board, "If I stay silent, who will speak?" No one erased it. No security guard intervened. In fact, hours later, the words were traced over in red by someone else, an anonymous hand. From that first slap, to the statewide investigation, to the reopening of 14 previously closed cases, from Wolfgang's glance to the voices of those once buried in silence, from the act of one man to the reflex of an entire system. Every piece seemed to circle back to the same suspended question. How long had we been asleep, that it took a slap to wake us? But the strangest part wasn't the outrage. It was the listening. Because for the first time in years, people didn't just react, they remembered. not through slogans, but through stories, not with spilled blood, but with collective memory. Wolfgang Ford was fully exonerated. His name was erased from Tennessee's criminal record system, and his mother, Oralee Ford, gave no speech at the press conference. She simply embraced her son before dozens of cameras and whispered something no one else could hear. But Wolfgang nodded, and tears quietly fell onto the old shirt he had worn through all 3 court sessions. In the final internal report of the Judicial Reform Commission, there was one small section, only a single line, but marked in red. Never let a slap become the only way a society agrees to wake up. And perhaps from that very slap, an entire system that once believed itself untouchable had begun to relearn how to look into the eyes of those it once deemed invisible. Something has finally begun to change. Join us in sharing meaningful stories by clicking the like button and subscribing. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and genuine empathy.